Halloween night is a time when the air is filled with anticipation, a sense of magic that lingers just long enough to let you believe that anything can happen. It's a night that feels alive with possibility, when children and adults alike step into the costumes of their wildest dreams, walking the streets not just in search of candy, but in pursuit of a feeling. There's something special about the way Halloween transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. And for many of us, the joy of trick-or-treating isn't just about the sweets that fill your bags, but about the shared experience, the connection you feel with the world around you. For me, Halloween has always been a time to reflect on those small, seemingly insignificant moments that later become cherished memories. This night wasn't any different. It was 2016, and my friends and I, 4 young adults on the brink of outgrowing our childhood traditions, decided to throw ourselves into one final round of trick-or-treating. Sure, we were a little older than most of the kids roaming the streets, but something about the night, the crisp air, the scent of autumn leaves, the familiar buzz of excitement made it impossible to resist. We weren't just collecting candy. We were reconnecting with the childlike wonder that comes with Halloween. Our neighborhood had always been a hub for Halloween activity, especially in the downtown area, where the houses were packed closely together. It's the kind of place where, if you time it right, you can hit several houses in a matter of minutes. The proximity of the homes meant there was no shortage of candy, and it was the kind of environment that made trick-or-treating feel like an adventure, even if it was familiar. As we walked down those streets, the laughter and chatter of other kids mixed with the ambient sounds of spooky decorations and the distant echoes of Halloween music, creating a backdrop that was almost cinematic. The houses, dressed in everything from orange lights to cobwebs, were our stage, and for a few hours, we were part of something larger, something timeless. By 10 p.m., however, the scene began to change. The crowds thinned out, and the bright lights of the houses began to dim. Halloween, it seemed, was winding down. The streets that had been bustling with families were now quiet, the laughter of children replaced by the soft rustling of leaves. It was a familiar shift, one that signified the end of the night's festivities. But for us, it wasn't quite time to go home. There was still magic left in the air, still an energy that begged us to stretch the night just a little longer. So, we abandoned our trick-or-treating bags and set off in search of something else, something to keep the Halloween spirit alive. It wasn't that we were bored or tired. It was just that Halloween, in all its chaos and excitement, has a way of filling you with an unshakable sense of possibility. It pulls you away from the mundane, encourages you to do something a little out of the ordinary. So, instead of calling it a night, we decided to head to the park nearby. The park had always been a place where we could act out whatever mischief was on our minds, whether that meant making a mess with silly string, writing on the bathroom walls with shaving cream, or just laughing at how absurd it was to still be so invested in a holiday designed for children. It was the kind of carefree act that only Halloween could encourage. The park was relatively quiet, but we weren't the first ones there. The remnants of other people's celebrations were scattered throughout. Silly string stuck to the slides, shaving cream smeared across the walls of the bathroom building. We found ourselves laughing at the mess, finding some joy in the fact that we weren't the only ones who had a little too much fun. But as we hung out on the playground, letting the night continue to unfold around us, Jay pointed toward the horizon. His voice was serious, almost urgent when he said, "There are 2 clowns walking toward us." At first, I thought he was joking. After all, it was Halloween. Clowns were a dime a dozen. But as I looked closer, the unease settled in. These were no ordinary clowns. One of them was the same figure we had seen earlier in the distance. A clown with terrifying makeup that seemed to bleed into the night. But the second clown was far more unsettling. Where the first had been creepy in a way that felt like a joke, this second clown carried an air of something darker. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, and there was something in the way he held himself that made my heart race with a kind of instinctual fear. As they drew closer, the unsettling feeling in my gut intensified. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this wasn't just a Halloween prank. Then came the moment that would mark the shift from Halloween fun to genuine fear. The clowns began to walk toward us, but their pace quickened. What had started as a slow, almost mocking approach suddenly became a full-on chase. Without thinking, we scattered in different directions, running in every possible direction to escape. My mind was in chaos. I didn't know the area well enough to navigate, but I knew one thing. I had to get to Ellis's house. It was the closest safe place, and that thought alone fueled my legs to move faster. I ran through the dark streets, my breath coming in short gasps, the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't dare look back. Halfway to Ellis' house, I realized I'd lost the clown. I pulled out my phone, hands trembling, and called Ellis. "I'm in your backyard," I said, trying to steady my breath. "I think I lost one of them." Ellis, equally out of breath, told me that he just evaded one of the clowns too and was on his way over. 10 minutes later, the four of us were gathered in Ellis's backyard, trying to piece together what had just happened. The adrenaline was still coursing through my veins, and for a moment we laughed, relieved that we were safe. But the fear lingered, faint but present, hanging in the air like a cloud that wouldn't lift. It wasn't until later, after we'd managed to calm down, that we started to question what had actually happened. Ellis texted us the next morning with a chilling revelation. He had found a rubber clown nose on the patio table in his backyard. Whoever had been following us wasn't just trying to scare us for fun. They had been watching us. And that thought, more than anything, sent a wave of unease through me. What had started as a simple Halloween tradition had quickly turned into a real-life horror story. But the scariest part wasn't just the clowns or the chase. It was the realization that Halloween, for all its tricks and treats, can be a reminder of how easily the line between fantasy and reality can blur. What was meant to be a night of fun had shown us a darker side of the holiday, and it left me with a deeper understanding of just how unpredictable life can be. Halloween is about more than just costumes and candy. It's a reminder that even in the most familiar of settings, the unexpected can emerge. Whether it's the thrill of a haunted house, the rush of running from something that's not quite real, or the rush of realizing that maybe, just maybe, the fear we experience isn't all make-believe. That night changed something for us, something we'll carry with us every Halloween from here on out. And while we might still laugh at the clowns and joke about it years later, there's always that underlying truth. Fear is real, and Halloween is as much about confronting it as it is about celebrating it. As Halloween night began to settle in, there was a palpable shift in the air. The initial excitement of trick-or-treating, the energy of running from house to house, the thrill of seeing the streets filled with costumed figures, gradually gave way to a more haunting quietness. It was the transition from lighthearted fun to something darker, something more uncertain. The streets, once alive with laughter and eager footsteps, now felt empty and abandoned. By 10 p.m., the crowds had thinned, and by 10:30, we were among the very few left. Most houses had turned off their porch lights, and the doors had closed. What had once been an exciting, sugar-fueled adventure now felt like a fading echo, a distant memory. It wasn't so much that we wanted to stop. It was just that the night seemed to have slowed down, as if it was losing its grip on reality. But we weren't ready to let go. Halloween isn't just about collecting candy, after all. It's about embracing the night, about holding on to something magical, no matter how late it gets. So we decided to stray from the beaten path. We left the streets and ventured to the nearby park, a familiar place where we could let our guard down and act as carefree as we had when we were younger. The cool autumn air mixed with the faint scent of distant bonfires, and for a moment, we were transported back in time. We were four friends, free of responsibility, free of the burdens of adulthood, reconnecting with the essence of Halloween. It wasn't about the candy anymore, it was about the feeling, that sense of freedom and joy that comes from being outside at night, with no particular destination in mind. The park, as expected, was quiet. It was dark, the kind of dark where the shadows stretch long and the trees loom like sentinels. The playground equipment loomed in the distance, now just shapes against the backdrop of the night sky. We weren't the first ones to arrive. Remnants of other people's fun were still visible. Silly strings stuck to the swings, streaks of shaving cream smeared across the walls of the bathroom building. It was as if we had stepped into a forgotten scene, one where the echoes of laughter still hung in the air, even though the people who created it had long since gone. We couldn't help but laugh, not at the mess we had found, but at how absurd it all seemed. Here we were, a group of almost adults, still finding joy in something so simple, throwing silly string, making a mess, acting like we were still kids. But then something changed. A feeling crept up on us, unnoticed at first, until it became undeniable. Jay, who had been scanning the horizon, suddenly froze. His voice broke the calm of the evening, sharp and urgent. "There are 2 clowns walking toward us." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, no one moved. We all turned to look, half joking, half expecting it to be some late-night prank, just another Halloween trick. But as we focused on the figures in the distance, a chill ran through me. There was something unsettling about the way they moved, slowly, almost deliberately. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a costume. These weren't ordinary Halloween clowns. At first glance, the clowns appeared to be like any other Halloween costume: brightly colored clothes, exaggerated makeup, fake smiles. But as they drew closer, I could feel my stomach tighten, my pulse quicken. The first clown was unsettling, but it was the second one that truly unnerved me. His makeup was far more grotesque, the lines of his mouth stretching impossibly wide in a permanent smile. It wasn't just the makeup, though. It was the way he moved. There was something off about him, something that made my body respond in a way that wasn't just fear, but a deep primal instinct that screamed at me to run. His every step seemed calculated, almost predatory, and the further they approached, the more the air seemed to thicken around us. The sense of unease deepened, turning from nervous laughter into something much darker. What had once been a fun Halloween night had now become something unsettling. When the first clown reached for something in his pocket and pulled out what appeared to be a long, spear-like object, the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't some prank gone too far. We weren't just being scared for fun. Something was wrong, and we were in the wrong place at the wrong time. My mind raced as I realized the danger we were in. The idea that this was just Halloween fun vanished in an instant, replaced by the harsh truth of a situation that was quickly spiraling out of control. And then, just as quickly as that moment of recognition hit, the chase began. It wasn't even a hesitation. They moved with frightening speed and purpose, and before I knew it, we were all running in different directions. The sound of our footsteps echoing in the silence of the park only added to the tension, as if every corner held something worse than we could imagine. My heart pounded in my chest as I sprinted, not knowing exactly where I was going, but desperate to get away. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I knew one thing. I had to get to Ellis's house. It wasn't far, and it was a place where I knew I would feel safe, where I could regroup and try to make sense of what was happening. My breath came in ragged bursts as I ran. My mind only focused on one thing: escape. I didn't dare look back, not wanting to know how close the clown might be. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, the dark streets around me blurring in the periphery. When I finally reached Ellis's house, I slammed through the backyard gate and collapsed against the fence, gasping for air. It wasn't until I was safe in the yard, the gate locked behind me, that I allowed myself to pause, to let the reality of the situation settle in. I pulled out my phone, my hand still trembling, and called Ellis. "I'm here. I lost one of them," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. Ellis, still breathing heavily, said he had just managed to lose one of the clowns as well and would be over shortly. He reassured me, though there was an undeniable edge to his voice, a hint of fear that had crept in where there had been none before. 10 minutes later, the 4 of us were together again in the safety of Ellis's backyard, gathering our thoughts, trying to make sense of the fear that had taken over. The adrenaline slowly began to fade, but the unease lingered, like a shadow that wouldn't go away. As we tried to calm down, we found that we were laughing, but it wasn't a laugh of relief. It was a nervous, shaky kind of laughter. It wasn't until the next morning that the full impact of what had happened hit us. Ellis sent a text telling us he had found a rubber clown nose on his patio table. It was placed carefully, deliberately. Someone had been watching us. The realization sank in slowly, filling me with a cold dread. It hadn't been a random encounter. They had been following us, and we hadn't even known it. That Halloween, what began as a simple night of fun had evolved into something far darker, something far more real than we had anticipated. The fear we had felt, the sense of being watched, was not just a product of our imagination. It had been real, and it had left us with more questions than answers. Halloween had reminded us, in a way we hadn't anticipated, that the world isn't always what it seems. And sometimes, the things that frighten us the most are not the ones we expect, but the ones that are hiding just out of sight, waiting to make their presence known. As the night unfolded and the events took an unexpected and chilling turn, everything seemed to move in slow motion. What had started as a fun, carefree Halloween night with friends quickly transformed into something that tested our courage, our instincts, and our understanding of what was truly real. We had been out trick-or-treating in the heart of the city, surrounded by the energy of families, children, and the infectious excitement that Halloween always brings. The streets were filled with life, the houses decorated with a mixture of festive cheer and spooky thrills. But as the clock struck 10 p.m., the atmosphere shifted. The laughter began to fade, the houses started to turn off their lights, and the streets grew eerily quiet. What had once been a night of vibrancy and joy now seemed empty, hollow. The fading energy of Halloween in the air left us craving something more, something that could reignite the thrill we had just lost. Rather than retreating back home, we decided to stay out longer. It was a Saturday after all, and the night was still young in spirit, even if the streets told a different story. The park nearby became our next destination, a familiar place that had always offered a sense of freedom, where we could escape from everything and just let loose. The cool night air mixed with the scent of fallen leaves, adding a layer of nostalgia to the scene, making it feel like a moment suspended in time. There was something magical about the way Halloween seemed to hold on just a little longer when you weren't quite ready to let it go. We were 4 friends together in a familiar place, laughing over silly string and old pranks, feeling like the night belonged to us, like we could do whatever we wanted and nothing else mattered. But then that familiar sense of calm began to waver. Jay, who had been staring into the distance, suddenly froze, his voice cutting through the soft air. His words sent a shiver down my spine, despite the fact that they were seemingly so simple. There are 2 clowns walking toward us. The moment those words left his mouth, everything changed. It wasn't the kind of statement that could easily be dismissed. We turned to look in the direction he had pointed, half joking, half expecting to see another group of Halloween revelers. But instead, there was something distinctly wrong about what we saw. 2 figures, clowns, yes, but not in the playful, exaggerated manner you'd expect for Halloween. These figures moved slowly, deliberately, and there was something about the way they carried themselves that sent a wave of unease through us. At first glance, the clowns seemed like costumes, bright colors, exaggerated features, the kind of thing you see at every Halloween party. But the closer they got, the more unsettling it became. The makeup on their faces wasn't just exaggerated, it was grotesque. Their smiles stretched unnaturally wide, blood red and haunting, and there was something in their eyes that didn't belong, something that made you question whether they were pretending or if they were truly something else entirely. What started as a strange curiosity turned into a knot of tension in the pit of my stomach. The closer they got, the more I realized that this wasn't just a costume, and this wasn't just another prank. There was a sense of danger hanging in the air, like something sinister was about to unfold. The vibe shifted from eerie amusement to palpable fear. The first clown wasn't the worst of the 2, though it was already unsettling enough. But the second clown, that one made my blood run cold. His makeup wasn't just excessive, it was haunting, distorted in a way that no costume should ever be. His eyes were unnervingly empty, like 2 hollow spaces in his face, and the way he moved wasn't human. There was something deliberate, something almost predatory about the way he walked. As he drew closer, I could feel my heart rate quicken, my breath becoming shallow. It was as if time itself had slowed down, stretching each second into eternity. My brain was fighting to comprehend what was happening, but it was too late to turn back. The moment I realized they weren't just clowns in costumes, everything shifted. They weren't here to play. They were here for something else. As they continued to approach, the air grew heavier, the silence between us stretching uncomfortably. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the first clown reached for something at his side. My heart skipped a beat as he pulled out what appeared to be a long, sharp, spear-like object. My blood ran cold. This wasn't some sick joke. This wasn't a late-night prank or some Halloween costume gone wrong. This was real, and we were the target. A feeling of sheer panic washed over me, so strong that it almost paralyzed me in place. The safety we had felt just moments before, foolishly carefree in the park, vanished in an instant. Before we could even react, before we could even process what was happening, they began to charge us. No words were exchanged, no warnings given. The sound of their footsteps, heavy and unhurried, became the soundtrack to our flight. The clowns closed the distance between us quickly, the unsettling knowledge that we were being chased setting in with terrifying clarity. The instinct to run kicked in immediately, and we scattered in different directions, sprinting into the night, each of us desperate to find safety. My mind raced as I looked for a route to escape. I wasn't familiar with the area, but there was one place I knew well: Ellis's house. It was close enough that I could make it there, and it was a safe haven, a place where I could collect my thoughts and regroup. My legs burned with the effort of running faster than I ever had before. I didn't dare look back, too afraid to see how close the clown might be. The streetlights blurred past me, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the panic rising with each step. When I finally reached Ellis's backyard, I didn't stop to catch my breath. I just collapsed against the fence, desperately trying to calm myself. It wasn't until I was safe in the yard, the gate locked behind me, that I allowed myself to breathe again. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking as I dialed Ellis's number. "I'm here. I lost one of them," I managed to say, my voice trembling with adrenaline. Ellis, equally out of breath, reassured me, telling me that he had just managed to lose one of the clowns too. He would be over soon. 10 minutes later, the four of us were back together in the safety of Ellis's backyard, but none of us felt safe. The sense of terror hadn't faded. It lingered, like a heavy weight pressing down on our chests. The adrenaline had worn off, but the fear still gripped us tightly. We tried to laugh it off, tried to tell ourselves that it was just part of the Halloween madness. But deep down, we knew this wasn't just a trick. This wasn't a fun part of Halloween. This was real, and something about it felt different from anything we'd ever experienced before. It wasn't until the morning that the full weight of what had happened hit us. Ellis sent us a text saying that he had found a rubber clown nose on the patio table in his backyard. It was left there intentionally, placed to send a message. We had been watched. The realization that they had been following us, stalking us even, was enough to send another wave of dread through me. We hadn't just been part of some random Halloween scare. We had been the target of something much darker. What started as a night of simple fun, of celebrating the tradition of Halloween, had turned into a terrifying experience that none of us would ever forget. We learned that night that fear doesn't always come in the form of what you expect. Sometimes it comes quietly, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. And sometimes the real horror isn't the costumes or the makeup. It's the feeling that you're not as safe as you thought you were. Halloween had shown us that sometimes the things you fear aren't just fantasy. They're real, and they're closer than you think. The sense of unease lingered in the air as we tried to regain some semblance of normalcy. What had begun as a playful Halloween evening had quickly descended into a night of fear and confusion, leaving us all questioning what had just happened. It wasn't just the sight of the clowns that disturbed us, nor was it their strange behavior or the fact that they had been chasing us through the park. It was the realization that what had started as a night of fun and laughter had been turned into something more sinister, something that seemed to transcend the usual boundaries of Halloween tricks and pranks. The night had taken on an air of unpredictability that none of us had been prepared for. After we all managed to reach Ellis's house, we huddled together in the safety of his backyard, our hearts still pounding, our bodies still reeling from the fear we had just experienced. We tried to laugh, to brush off the incident as just part of the madness that comes with Halloween, but it didn't feel like just a joke anymore. The fear that had gripped us in the park didn't fade when we found shelter. If anything, it grew stronger, more palpable, hanging over us like a cloud we couldn't escape. Our minds raced, trying to make sense of what had happened. Why had those clowns targeted us? What did they want? And most importantly, who were they? In the quiet of Ellis's backyard, the adrenaline slowly began to wear off, but the sense of something being terribly wrong stayed with us. The sounds of the night, once so familiar, so comforting, felt different now, more distant, more threatening. The laughter of trick-or-treaters in the streets no longer felt innocent. The air seemed thick, heavy with the weight of the unknown. And as much as we tried to convince ourselves that we were safe, the truth was that none of us truly felt safe. The reality was simple. We had been watched, followed, and chased for reasons none of us could understand. That night, in the silence of Ellis's backyard, we realized that fear is a strange thing. It doesn't announce itself with loud, obvious signs. It sneaks up on you, creeping into your thoughts, settling deep in your chest until you can no longer ignore it. And when it does, you can't help but wonder what else you missed, what other dangers might be lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. What had we missed? How had we become the prey, not the hunters in this Halloween game? We all agreed to stay together for the rest of the night. None of us wanted to be alone, and the idea of splitting up and walking home through the empty streets seemed unbearable. But even as we tried to enjoy the rest of the evening, the specter of what had happened kept hovering over us. Every car that passed by, every shadow that moved in the distance, every creak of the house seemed magnified, being as if something was lurking just beyond our vision, waiting for us to let our guard down. The worst part of it all wasn't just the fear we felt during the chase. It was the knowledge that we didn't understand why any of this had happened. The clowns didn't just appear out of nowhere. They had been following us, watching us long before they decided to confront us in the park. The idea that someone had been observing us in silence, perhaps even planning their move, it added an entirely new layer to the fear we were already experiencing. What kind of people would do such a thing? And what was their motive? Was this part of some sick Halloween game? Or was there something more sinister at play? These were questions we didn't have answers to, and they gnawed at us, eating away at whatever sense of security we had left. The next morning, after a long and restless night, Ellis sent us a message. He had found something strange in his backyard. The rubber clown nose. It was sitting on his patio table, left there with a kind of eerie intention. It was clear that this was no accident. The clowns hadn't just been a random encounter. They had been deliberately watching us, tracking our every move. They had left behind a clue, a message, a token to let us know they had been there and that they were still out there, somewhere. The realization that we had been stalked, followed through the streets and into the park, hit us all like a cold wave. What had seemed like a simple Halloween scare had turned into something far more unsettling. We weren't just victims of some elaborate prank. We were part of something we couldn't fully understand. And that was the scariest part of all. There was no resolution, no neat conclusion to the events that had unfolded. The clowns had come and gone, leaving behind only questions and a lingering sense of dread. We had no idea who they were, what they wanted, or why they chose to target us. All we knew was that they had been watching us, and they had left a reminder that they could come back at any time. We tried to talk about it, to make sense of the events of the night, but every explanation felt too simple, too inadequate. It wasn't just the clowns or the chase that had shaken us. It was the overwhelming sense of vulnerability that came with not knowing why it had happened. Halloween had always been a night of thrills and fun, a chance to step outside the ordinary and experience something wild and exciting. But that night, it had taken on a much darker tone, one that we couldn't shake. The thrill had turned to fear, and the fear had turned to something deeper, a sense of unease that refused to fade. As the days passed, the memories of that night began to settle into our minds like a haunting shadow. We couldn't forget what had happened, and we couldn't escape the feeling that we were somehow marked by the events that had unfolded. Halloween would never be the same for us again. It had become a reminder of how quickly the line between fun and danger could blur, how the world around you could shift from one of excitement to one of terror in the blink of an eye. The fear we had felt wasn't just from the clowns or the chase. It was from the realization that sometimes the things that terrify us are the things we can't see, the things that exist just beyond our understanding. That night taught us a valuable lesson. Sometimes there is no clear explanation for the things that happen to us. We may never know the true intentions of the people behind the mask or the reason they chose us as their targets. But what we do know is that fear, in its purest form, doesn't always need an explanation. It's a force of nature, something that exists beyond our control, and sometimes the only thing we can do is survive it and move on. And even then, the memory of it stays with us, lingering in the corners of our minds, a reminder of what can happen when you least expect it. Halloween had taught us that fear isn't always the product of what we can see. It's often the result of what we don't understand. And that uncertainty, that unknown, is what makes fear so powerful. As the hours drifted by that Halloween night, the weight of the events we had just experienced started to set in. What had begun as a night full of excitement and childish wonder had quickly evolved into a chilling reminder of how unpredictable life can be. The strange, unsettling encounter with the clowns in the park had changed something within us. It wasn't just the fear that lingered in our minds or the adrenaline still coursing through our veins. It was the sense of vulnerability that had emerged, a quiet reminder that not all dangers are obvious and not all threats are easy to recognize. What had once been a joyful Halloween tradition now felt like a distant, almost innocent memory compared to the reality we had just faced. We had managed to escape the immediate danger, yes, but that wasn't the part that stuck with us. What haunted us, what refused to fade in our minds, was the uncertainty that surrounded it all. What had motivated those clowns to target us? What had they wanted? Why had they followed us, tracked our every move, and left us feeling exposed and vulnerable? These questions, with no clear answers, clung to us like an invisible fog that wouldn't lift. Halloween had turned from a night of childhood nostalgia into an unsettling reflection of how little we truly understood about the world around us. The unease didn't just end when the clowns disappeared into the night. It followed us, a constant presence in our minds. Even as we sat together in the safety of Ellis's backyard, trying to process what had just happened, there was a quiet panic under the surface. It wasn't just about the chase or the clowns' left terrifying appearance. It was the feeling of being watched, the feeling that we were not just participants in some Halloween prank, but rather victims of something more sinister. We had been followed for reasons we couldn't understand, and no matter how much we tried to laugh it off or rationalize it, the cold truth lingered. The next morning, when Ellis sent the message about the rubber clown nose, it felt like a sick joke, a twisted memento of the night we couldn't escape. It wasn't just the fact that it was left on his patio table. It was the realization that it had been placed there deliberately, with intention. Whoever had been watching us wanted us to know they had been there. They wanted us to remember. And that knowledge sent a ripple of dread through all of us. They had been close. So close. Had they been standing behind us when we ran through the streets, chasing us with the sole purpose of terrorizing us? Or had they been observing us from the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike? In that instant, Halloween ceased to be just another holiday. It became a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can all be when we least expect it. The idea that the night had been about fun, laughter, and a sense of adventure felt trivial in comparison to the reality we now faced. The innocence of the evening had been shattered, replaced by the harsh reality that danger is not always what it seems. Sometimes it's right there in front of you, waiting to reveal itself when you least expect it. What had started as a night of childish excitement had now become a night that would stay with us forever. Not because of the fun we had, but because of the terror we had experienced and the uncertainty that followed. The weeks that followed were filled with uneasy silences and questions we couldn't answer. We didn't talk about the clowns much. Part of us wanted to pretend it had been some strange, fleeting incident, something that would fade with time. But that wasn't the reality. What had happened to us that night wasn't something we could just ignore. It had left a mark on all of us. The feeling of being watched, the realization that we had been the target of something far beyond our understanding, was not something that could be easily shaken off. It changed the way we saw the world. It made us more aware, more cautious, more fearful of the unknown. In the quiet moments when we found ourselves alone or in the middle of everyday life, the memory of that night would come rushing back. The dark figure of the clown standing in the shadows, the sudden, inexplicable fear that had seized us, and the overwhelming feeling of vulnerability that had swept over us in the park. It was all so vivid, so real. It wasn't just the physical chase. It wasn't just the fear of being pursued. It was the realization that the world isn't always as it seems. That night we had learned a valuable lesson. The safety we so often take for granted can be shattered in an instant, and the things we fear aren't always the things we see with our eyes. What we had experienced was not just about a Halloween scare. It was about the deeper, more unsettling truth that sometimes the things we fear are not those that are immediately visible, but the ones that linger just beneath the surface. The fear of being watched, of not knowing what's around the corner, is a fear that never truly leaves. And as time passed, we found ourselves constantly questioning the safety of our surroundings, always wondering if there was someone or something lurking just out of sight, waiting for its moment to strike. But perhaps the most unsettling part of all was the uncertainty, the lack of answers. We would never know who those clowns were or what their intentions had been. We would never understand why they had chosen us, why they had targeted us on that particular night. In many ways, that unanswered question haunted us more than anything else. We were left with an empty space, a void where an explanation should have been. It wasn't just the fear of the unknown, it was the helplessness of it. The realization that sometimes there are no answers, no closure, no way to understand what has happened to you. That Halloween night left an indelible mark on us, not just because of the fear we felt, but because it reminded us of the fragility of life and how quickly things can change. It reminded us that the world isn't as safe as we often think, and that the things we take for granted, the sense of security, the illusion that we are in control, can be ripped away in the blink of an eye. The truth is, there will always be moments in life that we don't fully understand, moments that test our resilience, our courage, and our ability to keep moving forward in the face of fear. And while the memory of that night will always stay with us, so too will the lesson it taught us, that fear is not just something we confront in the moment, but something that follows us, shapes us, and changes us forever. In the end, Halloween 2016 wasn't just a night of costumes, candy, and mischief. It became a powerful reminder of the unpredictability of life and the vulnerability we often take for granted. The terrifying encounter with the clowns, the feeling of being stalked, chased, and watched, taught us lessons that went far beyond the thrill of Halloween. It wasn't the fear of what was physically chasing us that left the greatest impact. It was the realization that sometimes danger doesn't announce itself with loud alarms. Sometimes it lingers in the shadows, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. This experience challenged our perception of safety and reminded us that the world can change in an instant. We learned the importance of being aware of our surroundings, trusting our instincts, and never dismissing our gut feelings. But perhaps the most significant lesson was the strength we discovered within ourselves. Despite the fear, despite the confusion, we survived. We didn't let the terror break us. We let it fuel our resilience, pushing us to protect each other and face the unknown together. What this night truly taught us is that life is filled with unpredictable moments. And while we can't always control them, we can control how we respond. We may never fully understand why certain things happen, but we can choose to move forward with courage and grace, knowing that the strength we gain in the face of fear makes us even stronger. It's not the challenges that define us, but how we rise above them. And that ultimately is the most powerful lesson we can carry with us through life.